Let's now turn and maybe we'll just go here. Doug, you asked the first question. Rabbi, you asked the second. And Imam Zia, you asked the third. And go to it. I will keep an eye on the time while I collect the questions.
Zia, I want to ask you a question. I heard you say that in the Quran that there's a distinction that's made between, I'll use humanity and then people of faith understood as Muslims. Mm-hmm. Within Islam, there are divisions. You know, there's the Sunni and the Shia, and as we've seen in Iraq, a really painful divide even within the people of faith. I would venture to say that Sunnis perhaps view Shias as other, mm-hmm. as stranger, or and behave at times in punitive sort of ways, let alone what the ISIS thing and what's happening with the outsiders to Christians. Within Islam, how do you manage, or how would you interpret the treatment of others within the people of faith?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a question that comes up in more recent years, the issue of the Sunni versus Shiite. The main thing to understand is that what makes you a Muslim is fundamental beliefs. And if your fundamental beliefs are in accordance with the Quranic teachings and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, then you're a Muslim, irrespective of what you call yourself. Where the Sunni-Shia divide occurred was after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, when there was a difference of opinion as to who should take the leading role. Some people felt that it should be Ali because he was a blood relative of the Prophet Muhammad, and others felt that it should be Abu Bakr, who was a close friend and ally of the Prophet Muhammad throughout his life. The wisdoms of either camp, you know, whatever they had, the Sunnis would argue that, you know, it's not a king prince kind of situation where blood relatives are being handed down the mantle of leadership. It is more, you know, whoever is more responsible, whoever has the most authority, whoever has most respect amongst the people, he's the one who's supposed to take leadership. And the Shia viewpoint, and even in the ideology, the issue of the Ahlul Bayt, or the family of the Prophet, takes a very high role. It's a very important position in their philosophy and in their teaching. But the summary is that if you believe in the fundamental beliefs of Islam and you believe in the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah, you're regarded as a Muslim. So there should not be any kind of this kind of dispute and problem that takes place between Sunni and Shia. So much so that I know Iraqis myself, that there's intermarriages between Sunni and Shia. I used to live in Tampa, Florida, and I used to know families that had intermarried between each other. The problem that occurred again, it erupted after we kind of went in looking for WMD, exacerbated the situation that was already there, kind of under the surface, where Saddam had been given, you know, the positions to Sunnis for the most part. We came in and, you know, the Shiites now had an upper hand, and now it's time for revenge, and now it becomes kind of like a vicious circle. So what's going on now is more political in nature, not religious. So that's
do Sunnis and Shias both take Hajj at the same time?
Yes, they do.
And so there's no, you don't have a Sunni week and a Shia week?
The Hajj is done exactly the same time by everybody. They come at the same time.
Okay, thank you.
It's my turn to ask?
Yes.
I'm going to ask Imam Zia also. I'm going to ask this a question, phrasing in two ways. You might take it as the same question, you might take it as two different questions. One way to phrase it is, tell us about the websites.
Which websites?
The websites you mentioned. You said those websites that mentioned the dhimmi in a pejorative fashion.
Okay.
But wait a second. But the other way to phrase the same question is, what pains you in your tradition on this subject? Might be two questions, might be one, depending on how you take it.
The first thing that you mentioned, I think none of you are ignorant of the fact of which websites I'm talking about. Right-wing, neocon, that type of website.
Oh, no, not Muslim websites.
Not Muslim.
Oh,
No.
then I misunderstood.
Yeah, because Islamic teaching is not that, but I mean the way that is portrayed by the neocons and the right wing is that Muslims are out to just subjugate everybody and turn them into dhimmis, making it sound like being a dhimmi was some kind of slave or, second-class citizen or something like that. So, yeah, that's what I meant.
Can I respond or clarify? But aren't there websites, and I don't know, I assumed you meant websites of radical Muslims who are preaching hate based on the Quran.
Well, first of all, if there are websites, I wouldn't be going on those. I'd have the FBI knocking on my door the next day. But what you can probably say is that people like ISIS or ISIL or whatever you want to call them, they are not practicing the essence of Islamic teaching when it comes to minorities. Going around, invading villages, killing minorities, forcing them into Islam, or killing them. This is far away from the teaching of Islam. And as I mentioned, historically, Muslims, they ruled so many countries that there was never forcing or coercion or killing people based on their faith, and they lived for the most part in harmony with each other. So what pains me about this issue is verses of the Quran that are taken out of context, first and foremost, by Muslims and by non-Muslims. And the Muslims basically, obviously, these terror groups that basically justify their actions by portraying these Quranic verses out of context and making them sound like they are relevant in every situation or in today's situation, and justifying their actions by doing that. That's the biggest pain. And then the second biggest pain is the issue of critics of Islam like the right wing and neocons that do the same thing. So that's basically.
It's your turn to ask.
Oh yeah. Okay. Rabbi, question for you. You hinted at the issue of the Israel-Palestine divide and conflict, and hinted that even the basis of it may be founded in religious understanding or religious theology. Do you think there's a way that the rabbis and the orthodoxy can get together and teach, or I don't want to say transform your teachings into a way that becomes more conducive to promoting peace in Palestine and Israel?
Well, that's actually exactly what I've been working on in the past year. There's no doubt to me that Judaism has within it verses and sources that can go in this direction and verses and sources that can go in that direction, as I mentioned. And there's lots of different factors that determine whether we pull in this direction or that direction. Presently, we have a cycle of violence in which the fear of Palestinians and the distance from Palestinians reinforces our own stereotypes and then influences the way we interpret our religion. So it's a vicious cycle, not only of violence, it's a vicious cycle of how reality affects religion, and religious then affects reality, and back and forth. So how do we break that cycle? Well, there are, as Robert mentioned, there are religious institutions that try and break that cycle by internal Jewish study and bringing out the sources that are more embracing of the other and emphasizing that they have a legitimate place in our tradition. There is another methodology that says let's begin by people-to-people programs. When Palestinians meet Jews and Jews meet Palestinians and they see the humanity of the other, the hope is that once you have a consciousness, a reality, a visceral reality of the other as a human being, then that tends to, should affect your understanding and interpretation of your own tradition. to bring out the elements that are more universal and more embracing of the other.
I've got a question for you. Can I ask, Hanan, the question I've got for you is, in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, there are 5 women mentioned. Take Mary out of the equation. 4 of the women, all of them are non-Jewish women. It's Ruth, a Moabite. It is Rahab,
prostitute.
and a Canaanite.
Yes.
And so, these are folks you're supposed to regard as a foreigner, and yet they are, even in the Hebrew text, would be outsiders, foreigners who play a pivotal role in the history of salvation. Reconcile in my mind, or help me understand, do you see these as just notable exceptional cases that, or are those the seeds of a subversive view of the foreigner?
Good observation. The Torah says explicitly that a Jew is not allowed to marry a Moabite. On the other hand, in the book of Ruth, in the Hebrew Scripture, one of the 24 books of Hebrew Scripture, there's a whole story of a Moabite who marries a Jew, and not only does she marry a Jew, but at the end of the story is a genealogy that says that of this union between the Jew and the Moabite was born the father of King David, who's one of the greatest Jews who ever lives and is the author of salvation. So clearly, to me, it is meant to be, the story of Ruth is meant to be a counterbalance to the Torah commandment not to marry the Moabite. So you have the particularistic, exclusivistic verses, and then you have the story that comes to counterbalance that. And I'll just tell you, and something similar with Rahav. She is understood actually to be someone who married Kalev. According to the Jewish church, she married Kalev. She became a central element in Jewish tradition. So you have the same thing. So just let me tell you something interesting. The Torah says you're not allowed to marry a Moabite. A Jew is not allowed to marry a Moabite. And in Hebrew, there's a clear distinction grammatically between the feminine and the masculine. And when we talk generally, we talk in the masculine. So the Torah says that you're not allowed to marry a Moabite. The rabbinic interpretation, in light of the story of Ruth, is, well, Ruth wasn't a Moabite, she was a Moabitess. So you're allowed to marry a Moabitess if you're a man, you're just not allowed to marry a Moabite if you're a woman. And so that distinction between men and women creates an equality. In other words, 50% you're not allowed to get involved in Moabites, 50% you are. It depends if you're a man or a woman. And there we have that unique balance within Judaism, the particular and the universal.
Thank you. Okay, let's move to a few of the questions from our audience, and then we'll have some closing remarks. One of the, and I'm not going to read every question on everything. I'm going to try to make sure we shift them around. But the first one I have is, Imam Zia, you mentioned the Islamic State as a general concept within which the dhimmis live. Can you say a little bit more about what would constitute an Islamic State?
What will constitute an Islamic State is basically you have what's known as a Khalifa, which is a leader, a Muslim leader, and then that leader would then implement the rulings of the Quran, the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad amongst the people. But you just make an Islamic State. It is basically, God says in the Quran that it is a product of your deeds. The Islamic State or leadership or ruling of a place, it is a product of your deeds. And it says in the Quran, this I quote a verse, God promises those people that have faith from amongst you and did good deeds, that He will make them the rulers of the earth. So it's not that you work from the top up, you work from the bottom up, you work from the grassroots, work on your deeds, become better people, become pious people, become God conscious, do what God wants on the earth in terms of obedience to His teachings, and the end result of that will be that God will give you Khilafah or the rule over the earth. It doesn't work the other way, that you rule from the top down. This is not what Islam teaches.
Okay, thank you very much. Rabbi Hanan, the information you've presented for us, which is very interesting, and I assume especially the last part in which you talk about the problematization of orthodoxy shrinking. The question is, do you present this same kind of information when you speak in synagogues, and what is the reaction of other Jews when you say this?
I could give a kind of funny answer, which I shouldn't, but I will, which a lot of synagogues don't want me anymore. No one left. But the truth is that Jews, in general, don't have a problem with me speaking as I did tonight. They don't have a problem with me speaking as I did tonight to Jewish audiences. It's that I say these things to non-Jewish audiences that bother the Jews. Why do you wash our dirty laundry in public? But I think that the honesty is crucially important. I want you guys to know what makes us tick, warts and all. Just as I want Jews to understand the problematics of some of our interpretations.
Thanks. I'm looking. There's a quotation here from Paul's letter to Titus, in which Jews are called negative things, liars, gluttons, and etc. I'm looking for the exact passage here, so I could read it to you, Doug. But let's generalize this. The New Testament does speak negatively of Jews in a variety of places, and Titus may be the most extreme. And how do Christians understand those very, very negative comments about the Jewish people?
I think the first response that I would make is the New Testament also calls Christians those things. So, you know, it's not an us-them on the topic of sin. You know, that we are all created in the image of God and have that fundamental human unity, but Genesis 3 in the Christian mindset intervenes and corrupts all of that. And so the divisions that Hanan celebrates and that I think we would recognize, we see as being part and parcel of our brokenness and fallenness. And so when you see a description of a category of people, I think the important quality to see there is it's not you know, you're the sinner and we're not. It is we're the sinners. We all, anytime you find a vice list, and that's what that is in Titus, a vice list, those vice lists function in Scripture as a way of catching all of us up into the category of sin. I don't think you're going to find an argument being made, we're the righteous and you're the unrighteous. It's we're the unrighteous and we are eligible for forgiveness.
Yeah. I'll just mention, Paul says some negative things about Cretans too. Those are from people from Crete, and in fact that comes into the English language. He's a Cretan.
Paul says some really negative things about Corinthian Christians.
Actually, yes. He's actually when Paul is in a mood, he can really go negative for you. I'm going to make one other additional comment, if I could, which is Christians try to read the New Testament in its historical context. And one of the things we can see is that relatively early in the Christian movement, when Christians and Jews had a better relationship, criticisms of the Jewish community are focused on particular aspects of the Jewish community that are problematic for Christian teaching, scribes, Pharisees, etc. But by the time we get to the later letters of Paul and the Gospel of John, Christians and Jews are going through a bad divorce. The Jewish council at Jamnia is busy cursing the Christians, and Christians are willing to return that. And it's from this later period in the early Christian history that we begin finding Christian generalizations of Jews that are very, very negative. And so I always like to say that this is the kind of language that goes on through two peoples who are going through a bad divorce and who will later regret that they spoke that way, right? But our scripture, to be fair, has a record of the fact that we didn't get along very well around 80 AD. wasn't so happy for us. There's a couple of theological questions here, and I'm going to, I'm going to mention them and not ask you to respond to them directly. And one is the classical question of the difference between the Trinitarian concept of monotheism, and isn't that a barrier to relationships of belief between Christians, Muslims, and Jews? Yes. And so it is, but that's a theme that we'll explore in more depth in a more theological evening. And then we have a question here, Genesis 12, 1-6, Abraham and Isaiah are blessed to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. Is this not a universal embrace of all human beings? And I suppose, since this is a quotation from the Old Testament, this is a question for you, Hanan.
And all the families of the earth shall be blessed through you, as that verse says, assumes that there are separate families. That distinction. My understanding is, the Jewish understanding is, and actually Doug and I talked about this here at the church Sunday night in our Jewish Christian Bible study, that the Jewish people, in this case it's Abraham, is meant to constitute the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, and that Jewish nation is basically meant to be a light unto the nations, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation that are like a hothouse that develops among themselves as a testing ground of high-level morality and religiosity. And when and if they succeed among themselves, they're supposed to spread that out and teach it as a model to the rest of the world. So that is, in one sentence, it's particularism in the service of universalism. The particular Jewish people is meant to be separate and particular, but to shine forth so that it will benefit, ultimately, the other nations of the world, the whole human race. Particularism in the service of universalism.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to make, that is all of the questions that were turned in. I'm going to make a few closing remarks, some observations, and then we'll ask Rabbi Schlesinger to give some closing remarks about his specific project. A few things occur to me, and one is what has emerged at the ending of each talk is the role that history plays in the way in which each community interprets and chooses its particular verses to shape its identity. And so when we're at different places in history, we're able to be more universal and loving, and in other places we withdraw into ourselves as communities and defend our identity. And I want to mention one thing that affects all of us here, and that is that we now live in the Western world, or the North Atlantic world. We live in the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment period. And the Enlightenment posits a completely different understanding of universalism among human beings than is posited in any of the three religions in their classic pre-Enlightenment or pre-modern period. And so one of the great struggles of who is the other and who is the stranger relates to the fact that as all three religions cope with the Enlightenment, they have to struggle with new ways of seeing universalism and what makes all humans the same. And part of that has to do with the idea that you talked about our spiritual genetics, but just bringing up the genetic thing reminds us that we're genetically human, and that the surface appearances of race and this sort of thing that we have are such a minuscule part of the genetic code that they're almost indistinguishable or impossible to find. We know that all Europeans are descended from 7 closely related women. Right? We can trace this through the mitochondrial DNA. So we talk about Germans and English and French and all of this. Well, basically, almost everybody in the Mediterranean world, and that's North Africa as well, had one of 7 mothers who were like aunts or something. Okay, so genetics becomes sort of this universal basis. And that access to that presses us towards other universalisms. We share 99% of our DNA with the great apes. Whoa, that's pretty close. Of course, you got to consider we share 95% of it with fruit flies. So, I mean, it turns out we've got to make these distinctions more finely than we once did. But the very fact that we would talk about these genetic things as binding us together means that we've conceptualized universalism of the universal in humanity differently in the Enlightenment. And we've also begun to conceptualize particularity in a different way. And in particular, we have the creation of the nation state, right? Which makes us citizens in common. We're all American citizens, albeit of different ethnicities, of different religions, etc. Okay? But as American citizens, we're quite different than citizens of Israel. We're quite different than citizens of Iraq. We're quite different than citizens of Pakistan. So we found new ways of drawing distinctions, even as we found new means of universalism. And I think all the religions are struggling in this move, right? Because our language and our thoughts are still focused back in the pre-modern era. Listening to all of the talks, all three acknowledge that difference between peoples is God's intention. That's written into the scriptures, that God intends us to be different. It's interesting that the focus, my guess is that nobody would disagree on our panel, and yet the foci is different. And Hanan already said it, Reverend Schlesinger already said it. The Jewish concept focuses on vocation. Jews are a distinctive people because they have a distinctive calling, a distinctive vocation. And because God acted in history in a specific way, just for Jews. But the Old Testament also tells us that other people are also called, and other people, God acts with other people in history. And so that concept of vocation becomes a way of differentiation, the families of the earth, okay? Within the Christian tradition, as Pastor Skinner pointed out, difference is seen on one hand as a sign of brokenness, right? It's a sign of sinfulness that the humanity broke apart, and that was willful. And so it's a particularly Christian interpretation of the Old Testament narrative. But that narrative also goes on, and as you pointed out at the end, in the book of Revelation, to talk about the reuniting of humanity. But what's interesting in the narrative of the reuniting of humanity in Revelation is that the distinction between the nations of the earth, the Gentiles, the Gentes, is perpetual. They do not become one nation again. So all of these things in Revelation 21 are plural. And the kings of the earth will bring the nations of the earth and their different gifts. So here diversity is seen as a positive thing because it means many different gifts can be offered to the king, right? So diversity has its, rather than being sort of vocational diversity, it's the diversity of gifts that can be offered up, the diversity of praise and worship. And then in the Islamic tradition, this idea of made you to know each other and to compete in righteousness. So this idea is there are many different families of the earth because they compete with each other to see who can be more righteous. And that's good for us. We need someone who pushes us a little bit and says, well, I know you're acting good, but look at me, I'm acting better. Well, they wouldn't say that. That wouldn't be humble, but you get the idea. I look over at him and say, you know, oh, he just wrote a check for X number of dollars. I'm going to have to write a check for more than that because I think I'm a more righteous person than he is, or she. Okay, take that note, those of you who raise funds. Okay? So all acknowledge that difference is God's intention. Each puts a slightly different focus on the source of that intention, and I think therefore there's something we can learn from each other. Because my guess is if we looked in all of our scriptures, we would see these themes played out. The second thing is that we find that there's very different reasons for loving the stranger, although within all of the religions, there is the idea that you should love the stranger. Okay? For Muslims, as we heard from Imam Zia, the strangers are created for our good. And in any case, it's God's command that we love. In the Jewish tradition, empathy seems to be a key theme. You were strangers. You've been in that position. You should feel for them. You should have a fellow human feeling for them. And in Christians, oddly enough, there's an echo of the Jewish theme, you've been in that position, but this position that you've been in is you're a sinner, just like they are. And therefore you stand in the same need of salvation. So again, in all three, we see that there's a command to love the stranger, but a slightly different emphasis in the reason for why you should love the stranger. Right? Okay, I think that's what I learned from this, and what that comes out for me is that there is a great deal we can learn from each other, because these were not contradictory presentations, but very realistic presentations. And I think we look in modern history, we see this problem of the stranger, and we see that in each different tradition, each different religious tradition, there are different forces that have acted historically to make us less than what we would like to be, right? And I think to understand that will help us differentiate between the good that each religion teaches and the bad that religious people do, if that makes sense. Okay.